Y bueno, estamos ahorita, digamos, el grupo con que estamos es un grupo de un curso donde damos las bases de conservación del patrimonio arquitectónico. Y uno de los contenidos propiamente es sobre técnicas de conservación, ¿verdad? Y gemelos digitales, pues creo que ahorita es de los temas que está en la punta eh, de los procesos de conservación de patrimonio, y por eso es que te invitamos.
Muchas gracias por la invitación. Es que
Y,
sí,
y
bueno,
bueno,
sí.
chicos, chicas, para presentarles a Pierre Joun, eh, arquitecto belga. Si me equivoco en algo, Pierre, porfa, me corregís. Arquitecto belga, que está en su doctorando en la Universidad de Liege, y ha escrito artículos muy interesantes sobre gemelos digitales, que de hecho son base para el proyecto de investigación que llevamos aquí en la escuela. Y, y ahí le tocamos la puerta a Pierre cuando que nos ayude. Este, que de hecho, hace un anuncio rápido, ya tengo el borrador del acuerdo con la Universidad de Liege, después hablamos de eso. Eh, bueno, Pierre me mencionó, no sé si así va a ser, que le es más fácil eh, hablar sobre gemelos digitales en inglés. Entonces, no sé, probablemente la presentación sea en inglés, y vos igual me decís.
Sí.
Eh, Perfecto. Para aquellas personas que no lo dominan del todo, no se preocupen. Igual yo subo el vídeo, este, como lo hacemos siempre, ¿verdad? Y ahí ya aparecerían subtítulos por aquello. Entonces, nada, Pierre, somos todos.
Bueno, muchas gracias y sí, como comentaste, voy a presentar en inglés porque, bueno, a pesar de que pueda hablar en español, no tengo el nivel académico para hacerles una presentación técnica de este tema del gemelo digital. Así que voy a hacer el switch al inicio de la presentación. No temen en interrumpir. En todo caso, si tienen alguna duda, alguna pregunta, creo que es mejor hablar directamente del tema que media hora después, que capaz nos olvidemos de algo. Voy a tratar de compartir la pantalla. Uh, Perdón, estoy acostumbrado al Teams. No veo.
Al
¿Sí puedo?
final,
Ujú.
al final hay un icono verde.
Ah, sí, sí, gracias,
Ah,
perdón. Me había perdido. Ahí está. Perfecto. Listo. ¿Sí pueden ver la presentación?
sí,
Ok.
pero o sea, lo que estamos viendo es el PDF. No estamos viendo modo presentación. No sé si.
No, no es normal. Entonces es un problema del... A ver, voy a empezar de nuevo.
Cuando le das compartir y elegís la pantalla, puedes elegir
¿Debo
digamos,
compartir la aplicación o la pantalla?
mejor la
Aplicación.
pantalla.
Ah, la pantalla, entonces. Déjame ver si aquí funciona. ¿Sigue igual?
Sí.
Ok, vamos a lograrlo.
Ok, listo.
¿Sí puede ver?
Sí se ve, pero no vemos vemos como una parte, no sé por qué.
Sí, sí, es raro. No tengo la opción de compartir toda la pantalla.
Sí, porque ahí lo vemos cortado.
Sí, sí, sí.
Si no, no importa, podemos ver el PDF.
No, pero debe haber una simple opción. Aquí tengo el desktop. Voy a tratar con ese otra vez. Aquí sí no funciona.
Seguimos viendo el... Ah, wait, ya, listo.
Bueno, raro, es lo que había hecho la primera vez, pero bueno, ya mejor que funcione. Okay, hi everyone. As José Pablo mentioned, I'm Pierre Joun from the University of Liege, and he kindly asked me to do a small presentation about the digital twin in the framework of your summer course, if I understood well, and in the bigger framework of the research project. I will try to speak a bit slowly, and as I mentioned, don't hesitate to interrupt me. So the presentation will be divided in 7 main parts. I will do a quick introduction about my PhD research. Then I will speak about the digital twin concept and how we could implement it and use it for the cultural heritage conservation. Then I will discuss a bit some challenges and opportunities about its implementation. And I will finally speak about the real focus of my research, which is the development of a data model for cultural significance data. I will explain further what I mean by these terms. And I will end with some conclusions and perspectives, and we will finally have some time to discuss. I hope you will have some questions, and we can do this part in Spanish, so no worries. So I form part of a research lab that focuses on the interpretation and communication of heritage in a really broad term. We work with art historians, architects. We have two archaeologists, and so we are about like 20 people with a very multidisciplinary approach. I myself am an architect. I have a Master of Conservation from the University of Leuven in Belgium. And I started a PhD in 2018 under the promotion of Pierre Joun, who's professor here. And together with him, we published a series of articles. I put 3 of them here because they are directly concerned by the presentation. The first one was published in the ISPRS archives in 2019 in the framework of the SIPA conference in Avila, Spain. It was a proposal for a methodology that I will discuss further in the presentation. Then this article was extended in a journal article in 2020, dealing with the HBIM and digital twin as well. And finally, the last one is also what follows, basically the 2 first articles, and focuses on this question of data structure for cultural significance data. So just a very quick introduction to what we mean by digital twin, so Gemelo Digital. Michael Greaves was one of the first scientists to define or to provide a definition for this term. I just pasted the text here, but basically it was a virtual representation, so that there was already this idea of a virtual model of the reality to kind of improve the design. So it was initially in the fields of aerospace, aeronautics, manufacturing industry, to improve the design of a product through an iterative process. And the digital twin really helps providing with data thanks to a bunch of sensors that allow to see how reacted a product and how to improve its design, going through several steps of monitoring the data coming from the sensors, simulating, and then doing some optimization the design to improve, as I said, the design towards all the steps of this process. And so this was the global idea of the digital twin. Since then, so after its application in aeronautics, aerospace, manufacturing and stuff, it started to be, of course, implemented in the urban planning sector, in the construction industry, also in the collection care, because using sensors and stuff is really useful to manage hygrometric and thermal conditions for collection care purposes and stuff. But the question was, can we use this concept for built heritage conservation? And that was actually the beginning of my reflection. And we could, well, that's the basic idea, replace the physical model and use a building instead of it's also a product of design. And in the field of architecture and built heritage conservation, we commonly use 3D models of these buildings. So we start to apply the IFC standard. So we are entering slowly in this BIM era, let's say. And so the idea was that there is some data available about heritage buildings, or that is becoming slightly available, and that we could reuse as the digital model in a digital twin process. But the thing is that instead of the design improvement, although it might be an objective for building retrofitting or strategies, similar strategies, the focus of the digital twin for cultural heritage will be really different, of course. So the objective pursuit. In this framework, the digital twin could rather be used for to assist stakeholders in the maintenance and the monitoring, to enable a better risk preparedness of the building, to provide with research data, and also implement methodologies and so support research, and to allow better knowledge transmission to very diverse stakeholders. I will just go back a little, just to detail a little bit what we have here on the scheme. So we have the physical model. So that's the basic concept of the digital twin, with a sensors network that allows to transmit some data to the digital model where this data is stored. Okay, so I need to move the cameras. There it is. There we can do the monitoring, perform some simulation to see how, if the current situation is continuing, what problems could it take, perform a diagnostic, doing some prediction and optimization to then improve the design. But as I mentioned here, it will be another logic. And I will come back to these different use scenarios of the digital twin in the cultural heritage sector. You might have come across some examples of, well, I would say these are some first examples of implementing part of the digital twin scheme, but it's mainly dealing with the digital model and sensing devices part, and less with the simulation, automated diagnostic, prediction, and all these sorry, use scenarios that I mentioned before. So here is for instance, the PetraBIM software. You might have heard about it. It's a software that allows to upload BIM models HBIM models, so 3D models of heritage objects with semantic enrichment and so on, and that are linked with sensors of network of sensors on the object, and allows to monitor specific variables according to some problems that have been detected or some risks that have been identified. But yet there are still some, and I will explain that later, some more stuff to implement to make the digital twin really worth and really useful in the conservation process. There is another example, which is the HBIM platform that also uses sensing devices. And there's a small publication, but it was mainly a platform doing the same than PetroBIM with a 3D model, sensing devices. With you had the possibility to see the evolution of the variables, but yet there was no comparison of this data with the significance of the place, its particularities, its history, and so on, which is of high importance, of course, when you deal with heritage. And so what we've done is that we propose a methodology to, that was the first article I mentioned before, in 2019, a methodology to support preventive conservation through significance, cultural significance awareness in already an HBIM and digital twin process. And the idea was, of course, to take advantage of the very complete and large data sets that we get at the end of the documentation campaigns, and use the HBIM and 3D models as the basis for the digital twin process. So the semantically 3D model, enriched 3D model, could be used to implement what I showed before. And the idea would be to perform some real-time data analysis based on the data got from the sensors, identify the risks, and propose already some interventions, evaluate the risks represented by these interventions themselves, to provide a kind of report to the decision makers so they can further implement conservation actions, monitor the impacts, and generate some statistics, and use all this data to enrich the database and improve optimize, let's say, the process along the life cycle of the object. So the idea in this scheme was really to enhance the impact of cultural significance data in a rather automated process, but we'll see that automating stuff in this field is quite complicated because there are a lot of factors to take into account that are not always objective and quantifiable. But so it was the main idea, let's say. And further, in the next article,
sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, but I have Valeria has a question. She said that, well, I will read in Spanish. No me quedó muy claro la diferencia entre la plataforma PetroBIM y HBIM platform.
Okay.
Ambas ven la evolución de las variables, pero ¿qué tienen de diferente? That's the question.
A ver, PetroBIM es un software, es un programa, es un programa comercial que ya no le encontré desde que escribí ese artículo. No sé si tuvieron algunos problemas, pero la idea era que podía pagar una licencia y trabajar con ese, era un programa comercial. El otro era creo que era una muestra de algún proyecto de investigación que utilizaron para mostrar sus resultados, pero igual esos ejemplos traté de volver a buscarlos ayer y no los encontré, entonces era más que nada para mostrar que esa tecnología de IoT, de sensors, ya existe y que eso no es el problema en la implementación del gemelo digital. Son solo ejemplos, pero ahora esas aplicaciones existen ya en otros programas, en otros portales para dejar HBIM models en el web o no sé o sea, mi intención no era ir más allá en esos ejemplos solo para ilustrar, digamos.
De hecho, Isabel Jordán menciona, no sé si sabes quién es Isabel, es,
No
ella ha
me...
escrito, bueno, ha escrito, pero no necesariamente de Digital Twins, pero lo que indica de Petrobin, la crítica es que en su momento no, no era como que no se actualizaba al momento la información y había que hacer como pasos ahí para poder actualizar. Esa era la crítica de Isabel Jordan.
Sí, y esos procesos, obviamente, utilizando esos sensores, el punto es que se actualice todo el tiempo y la dificultad realmente no se encuentra en eso de capturar datos, sino en la interpretación y en toda esa parte del diagnóstico, porque vamos a ver que para analizar unas patologías, entender cuál es la causa, ah, cuáles son las posibles intervenciones y cuál sería el impacto de esas intervenciones. Eso es donde se complica, digamos, el proceso. No sé si sigo o si
Sí.
hay una duda
No,
más.
mm, voy que hacía otra pregunta, pero fue directa. Ok, sí. Eh, es que, ok, el término HB, hay una pregunta con el término HBIM,
Ah, sí, sí, perdón.
que es
Pero-
Heritage Being Information Modeling. Lo que pasa es que se creó una plataforma que se llama HBIM Platform, eh, pero son, o sea, el concepto en sí, HBIM es Heritage Being Information Modeling, y lo que nos mencionó ahora Pierre sobre HBIM Platform es otro software que utilizaron en un proyecto de investigación. Listo.
Sí, bueno, HBIM es una extensión del BIM. La verdad es que la diferencia es muy pequeña. No sé si existe realmente. Es más en la manera de manejar y de modelizar la información, que es más complicado con la información del patrimonio, porque vienen más disciplinas en el proyecto, los arqueólogos, los historiadores, que en proyectos clásicos de construcción, digamos, y también en la representación gráfica de los modelos 3D, y tal vez por eso se diferencian, pero bueno, como dijiste, se trata del BIM para el patrimonio, para hacer en pocas palabras. Pero aplicar ese estándar es muy importante porque ahora en el sector de la construcción, como lo saben, me imagino que son estudiantes de arquitectura, entonces deben saber la importancia que tiene eso ahora y vamos hacia esa obligación de utilizar e implementar el BIM en todos los proyectos públicos, depende de los países, pero irán poco a poco aplicando eso como una norma. No quiero entrar más en el tema del BIM, pero podemos volver a la pregunta luego si les interesa. A ver, creo que eso no pasé todavía.
Yeah,
Está cierto.
that's it.
Sí. Entonces, luego de esta metodología, I was starting back in Spanish, I'm sorry. Good try. I, So after this first article, we extended the first one to present a research framework to go further in the development of this digital twin concept for cultural heritage. And the idea was to integrate this concept along all the steps of the conservation process, what was called the management plan process, that can be depicted with 4 main steps, a bit like in medicine. It's a bit the preventive conservation process, where you have first the analysis, then a diagnosis, a therapy that is proposed, and then the control. And of course, it's going back and forth along the whole life cycle of the object. And so first, the idea was, of course, to understand the whole process and to identify key steps that were going to be of crucial importance for the implementation of BIM. And here in the first steps, where we try to identify the object, understand is the managing context, there was this part of understanding the significance. And of course, if we speak about simulation, automated diagnostic and stuff, we can't do it without having a kind of quantification of the cultural significance. But how can it be done? So that was the initial question. And so for this part, the question was, can we quantify somehow some aspects of cultural significance data? Then in the second step, what are the risks faced by heritage properties, heritage objects? How can we evaluate their magnitude and propose some appropriate interventions to mitigate their effects? And finally, how can we implement and control these actions and while improving the system all along? And so if we look at the other scheme at the right side, so we have some data. So the scheme is already 2 years old, so it might be improvable, let's say. So we had the HBIM model with geometric data and some semantic data associated in the software. We had specific data sets related to the significance, the condition assessment, the risks, and so on. So specific to the case study. Then we had all the standards that were pertinent to the process. So when I mean by data standards, we have atlases of pathologies, damages, and so on. We have also atlases of materials, naming conventions for architectural elements and stuff. So for all this program to work, we have to be sure to name the things by their, or to agree on the name and on the meaning of these concepts, of course. So it's all these steps of adopting the appropriate standards. And then we had all these real-time data that was coming from the sensors, and from which we had to define the thresholds, the variables that were to monitor, and so on. And how the digital twin was working is that, so we had all this data that would be compared. So the data would be compared to the real-time data obtained through the sensors network, based on which we could identify some threats, assess the importance of the risks, and so on and so on. So this is the same idea that I mentioned before in the previous schema. See if I can. So in this one, just that it was a bit more detailed, but yet it deserves to be further discussed. And the idea, as I mentioned, was to give a first report with the multi-criteria evaluation, because of course an organization depends on resources, on skills, on its human capacity of applying and implementing the interventions, cost and time resources, and so all this has to be taken into account apart from the cultural significance and the characteristics of the object itself. And again, implementation, monitoring, and generating some statistics that would enrich the database. The conclusion of this article was a proposal of, so first, taxonomies to kind of structure the data related to these 4 aspects that I mentioned here. So these 4 points. So first scheme for the structuration of data related to the cultural significance of heritage places. And for this part, we adopted a framework proposed by other researchers. I will come back to that later. A second, it was not yet a data model, but rather a scheme, a taxonomy for risk identification and the relation with mitigation strategy and the elaboration of the risk magnitude that was further elaborated here and depended on so the potential loss of significance, the likelihood of the risk, the hazard to happen, and of course the importance of the damage, the potential damage. But as you can imagine, all these elements are very relative and very hard to quantify. It's all based on prior studies and so on. And the last part, which was about implementation and control of these solutions. So I think that the most interesting is to discuss all the challenges, because as you might have thought about already, looking at these schemes, okay, it seems very easy. It's a nice circular scheme, it seems to work, but when you look at it in detail, we see that there are, at every step of the process, a lot of challenges that will question the efficiency. Will it really optimize the process, or will it make it more difficult and less efficient finally than the traditional process? So in the first phase, which is monitoring the change, and so comparing the data that is coming from the sensors to what the variables should be, what are the limits, it means that prior to that, we have to identify potential risks, to define exact variables to monitor, because we cannot monitor everything and anything. We have to define stuff. It has to be doable. So we have to define the risk, but of course also the potential cause, the potential pathology and damage that are related to it, and possible strategies, so interventions that could be implemented. So that's the first part. There are already some atlases that have been proposed, but yet it's not universally accepted, and it depends on the region of the world where you are, which materials you work with, in which region you are. Are you in a zone with sorry, I forgot my activity in the, I'm sorry, seismic activity and so on. So depending on that, it will, this atlas will potentially vary. So there's still some work at this point. Then we have to establish a model to assess the risk magnitude. So the one I proposed before is based on a study published in 2012 or 14, if I'm not mistaken, but it was not yet perfect. It's all discussed in the paper, but it's all a quantification based on, okay, your instinct or your feeling at that moment as an expert, but yet it's not perfect and it has to be somehow taught a bit more. But yet, do you work based on an existent framework, or do you provide with a new one? It's still some extra work to do. Then you have to define the variables and the sensors that can monitor them. And finally, define the thresholds. So what are the limit value that can be acceptable, and above which you will have an error, an alert that will be given that will say, okay, there might be a threat soon and a potential loss of significance because of a specific change of variable.
I think that something that is hard to define is that something that it's important for us as an architect, maybe it's not important for somebody who works in this, I don't know, painting conservation or whatever. I mean, I think that the most difficult thing is to say, to identify what is important to this.
Yes. I completely agree, and I kept the most difficult part for the end. So indeed, I think the part on the data or heritage information, who uses it, for what purposes, how do we agree on something regarding from different disciplines, and how do we agree on the significance of something, the risks of something. So it's really, I think, indeed the most difficult part. The rest is rather tangible elements. Sometimes it depends just on an extra years of research. The others might be very subjective data sometimes, and it's okay, impossible to find a perfect solution, but maybe establish a protocol where all experts can discuss and convert to an agreed point. Okay, so that was for the first part, for the monitoring.
Sorry, Pierre, there's another question. Yes. In order to resolve the existing vulnerability in terms of details and program variables, it is not also preferable to carry out a photography survey?
Yes, okay, so this might come here. There are activities that are in the management plan process that I presented earlier. Here, so you have all this documentation part and so on, monitoring activities that are taught at the scale of the management plan process. And sometimes you have preventive activities, and part of them are monitoring activities. So it's just going on site, taking some pictures, and it's basically the same job done watching a sensor's evolution. So you could just come on site, take a picture, upload it on the database, and it's like another sensor, let's say. So I think it's one kind of data that could be used, and the digital twin somehow in this sense can help in assist the maintenance and monitoring work. So that's, I think that would come in this part. But you're absolutely right. It's not that everything will be automated with the digital twin. It's not a magic system. We'll still need human actors and stakeholders behind it. So I hope I answered the question. If not, do not hesitate even to speak and interrupt me. In the next phase, so it's further to establish a diagnostic. So when there is a problem in the value in the variable that is monitored, there is a threat. So it's all defined prior to the implementation of the digital twin. So then we have to determine the risks and its magnitude. And as I said, on the basis of which model do you calculate this magnitude? How do you determine the loss of significance? So you could say, okay, there are some risks, maybe floods or stuff, or earthquakes that could lead to the loss of a part of the site, maybe because it's more vulnerable, but maybe it's not the more valuable. So how do you take all these parameters into account? And how do you end up with a number saying, okay, this risk is very high because we have a very high likelihood of the risk to happen. It will cause a lot of damages, and then a lot of loss of significance. But to come to this result and to this conclusion, there is a lot to be discussed beforehand. How also do you identify appropriate preventive and curative measures? So we all know that when we establish a diagnostic, first, there are often in heritage conservation a lot of possible causes to a damage. We don't know for sure from the beginning which is the cause. So you already have a list of possible causes that you have to verify by doing some, how do you say that in English? Sorry. Sondage. So when you do some, for example, holes in the materials and you send it to the laboratory for analysis and so on, I've lost the word in English, I'm sorry. But so there are stuff that you cannot know even by visual observations. So imagine just by watching a bunch of sensors, it's often not enough to lead to a definitive conclusion of the cause and the complete effects of a pathology. So proposing intervention seems already quite difficult. And what would be interesting, though, is that the system could come to suggest, depending on some problems defined, a series of specialists to contact and a list of additional information needed to complete the diagnostic. So that would be a track, but to have all the things automated seems quite challenging. Then assess the diagnostic reliability. Of course, it's in line with what I've said, and indicate the need for additional data acquisition. So that would be, I think, the most reasonable objective of the digital twin in this process. Then for the optimization, you also have to assess the potential impact of interventions, because of course some curative interventions also can result in damaging some parts and also having as a consequence a certain loss of significance. And it's really hard if what I discussed before is not very clearly defined. How can you assess this impact? That's even harder. Further, what are the criteria? So it might be easier. So you have to, this depends basically on what you have defined here. So what are the priorities and how does the managing context work? What are the resources? What is the time? What are the time restrictions? So what are the constraints basically? And so this should also be defined beforehand if we want this multi-criteria evaluation to be performed in a rather automated way. So when you think about all the constraints and the problems and the challenges that I mentioned, my question was a bit, it's funny because I present this, but I'm showing you all the challenges that are still in front of us. Is it still optimizing the process for decision making, or is it just making more problems than it gives solution? And maybe there is neither a yes or, it's not a yes or no answer. It's just, I think it's case study specific. So you have to know your case study, have very specific objectives in terms of monitoring, maintenance or risk preparedness. So you have to know what risk do you want to monitor. You don't have to see this process as something that will allow you to control and to see everything. It's not the point. So results are only indications to accelerate the decision-making process. If it's not working that way, then you failed in applying something, because the digital twin is only there to support and to make the process more optimal. If it's not the case, then there's something wrong. As I said, then you have the implementation of the conservation actions. And there are some cases where automated actions can be, the implementation, of conservation actions can be automated, especially for monitoring and maintenance. For instance, in a museum, to manage, like say, thermohygrometric conditions. This can be changed by adjusting some parameters in a machine. But it's not that you will detect structural problems and you can directly send an engineer with a bunch of workers and solve no. So it still requires study. It's just that this whole process will help all the stakeholders to reach the adequate information at the good time. And I think that's where optimizing is. It's not in automating everything, It's just in giving access to the right people at the right moment of the good information, of course. And okay, did I go back in time? Sorry, I think I copied twice. No. Yes, and finally, so monitoring the intervention, so its efficiency on the basis of what? So if, again, we come back to the initial part of the scheme, if this is not clear, this is less clear, and this is even less clear. How do you want to assess automatically the impact of an intervention if you are not even sure of what has been automatically proposed as an intervention? So on the basis of what variables? Do you have to implement a new sensors network? So is it really necessary? Isn't it good? Aren't we going too far at this point? At least for now, I think it's not necessary. It really depends, again, as I said, on the case too. And then what data should be kept? How could it be used, interpret in the future? So of course, we can generate a lot of statistics to help further the process to gain in efficiency. But yet for all this data that we kept, we should have a protocol, and we should know how we're going to use it and what is it going to be used for. And finally, I wanted to come to this point, which is for me the most complicated. It's the heritage information, which is characterized by a very big diversity. So we have a very big diversity of disciplines involved, so experts that have different ways of representing the same data, of using it, and so they use different softwares, different data, different naming conventions, different data standards, data type, and so on. And so how do we combine it all and make it readable, usable by all these stakeholders? Then it's also characterized by uncertainty. So there are often missing things in heritage information. We have some hypothetical hypotheses, that are made based on the information that we have. But of course, it's sometimes incomplete, and we have to verify it on site to make further research to verify the information that we have. So inaccurate, incomplete, and uncertain, which makes it very hard to automate this whole process. And then we have subjective data, and this is more related to cultural significance. But this is crucial, of course, that's what makes the difference with the construction industry, the construction sector. Because if we don't speak about significance, it's like discussing about any other construction project. It's not discussing about conservation. So what makes the discussion different in heritage conservation is that we have these questions of cultural values. What are the values carried by heritage objects? Why is it considered as heritage? And there you probably already know that for different people, it will mean something else. At different times, it will mean something else. So 20 years ago, modernist heritage was not in some parts, in some regions of the world, even considered as something of value. Today, nowadays, in some parts of the world, is something that is completely considered as endangered. And a lot of people are fighting to protect this because we see that it's disappearing very quickly. So you see that the question of values can change very quickly and across different regions, even within the same society. We have different, because of cultural issues, people living in the same place at the same time valuing an object with in very different ways. So subjectivity is another very big issue, and that's why I decided to focus on this particular topic in my research. Then we have obviously interoperability. As we have a multidisciplinary approach, we have multiple data standards, conventions, data types, formats, vocabularies, naming conventions, and so on and so on. And so to make a unique system working, we have to establish protocol to make this interoperability between different systems, different representations, and so on, while keeping the data, while keeping it possible to integrate data, but also to export it and make it available again to other experts. So we might need to integrate the data of art historians or of architects, use it in the system, and it should be possible to export it again for them and to consult it and use it the way they use it in their field. But as there are challenges, there are also a lot of opportunities. And I think that's what makes a digital twin a kind of hot concept today in research. It's, I think, a way to assist maintenance and monitoring. And we've seen in the last year that the focus since the 70s on preventive conservation is increasing, of course, because it's less resources, less loss of significance, and it's pretty logic to take care of the monuments before they get damaged. And so digital twin can really assess organization in assisting them for the maintenance and the monitoring. So for instance, if you have a very big site and you have some ongoing pathologies on the facades, for instance, you could say that you need to do a photographic report every 2 or 3 weeks to make sure that you have a follow-up of the state and the degradation of the facade. And this can be, of course, implemented in a digital twin process and documented in there. So risk preparedness, we've discussed about that. It's not that easy, but if you have very well-defined risks and you study very well which variables should be followed, even if the last part, the simulation, prediction, and all this, the rest of the process is not implemented, is already something to have all this monitoring and an alert that is generated telling you what type of data you should acquire to verify the diagnostic. Then research, I think digital twin is a wonderful tool to perform research and to get research data. Of course, I'm focusing on cultural significance data, and I think digital twin can help transmitting data about cultural significance, so and help us to perform studies about the cultural significance of a place along its life cycle, for instance, but also in transmitting knowledge and informing the general public, but also making all this knowledge accessible to all experts and so on. Going too fast, to go a bit faster, sorry. So I think I went back, or this is something that I copy. Yeah. I'm not sure this had to come here. So I think it has to come, sorry, I'm a bit confused. Yeah, it was still about the cultural significance, I got it. So the thing is that this data about cultural values is mutable, so it changes, and it's deeply subjective, I already said that. And how could we quantify this data, or at least part of it, and how could it help the assessment of risk magnitude in a digital twin process? This is the whole question I made to myself at the beginning of the research. And so I started by proposing to implement this framework proposed by Fredheim and Calaf, two researchers in 2016, where they study all the value typologies that exist, that have been proposed since the use of values in the cultural heritage discourse. And they finally proposed a framework that is accessible and flexible. So it's made in a way that even non-expert stakeholders can use it and understand it. So it's very important with the way we lead conservation processes today. So the first step is what is the heritage in question, then what are its aspects of value and how valuable it is. I'm not going to go in detail about that, but that's what allowed me to propose a first data model for cultural significance, where we have here the heritage object, so the what, let's say, the aspects of value and the qualifiers. Although I tend to focus a bit less on this part of qualifying, I think this is something that is quite tangible and allows to have a sort of traceability of heritage significance data. And in the last article that I published in this year in the Journal of Cultural Heritage Management and Sustainable Development, we moved on with this taxonomy, and we proposed a data model that extends a previous data model in the field of archaeology that allows to trace all the information related to a historical object, and we generalize it to any object of cultural significance, implementing specific modules for linking cultural values to heritage objects and risks and so on, but as you could add any other semantic layer. This function layer, this link should actually come to the function layer, I'm sorry, could be seen as a semantic dimension, and you could add any standard depending on the disciplines involved in your project. Yeah, so I think I already discussed that. And the idea basically is to have a kind of life map of the evolution of the building regarding different aspects. So regarding its geometry, its function, its values, its evolving conditions, and the risks that are monitored. And every change in any of these dimensions generates an episode that gives in the end the life map of the assets, and which allows, it's like a container of data that allows in the end to generate a lot of representations, focusing here on the aspect of values, understanding that, for instance, this specific value was carried by the site and associated by specific agents at a specific stage based on a specific source. And what's interesting here is we don't go towards the quantification of values because we think it's not doable. It's completely subjective and it's not desirable, but it's very important to trace all these judgments and to keep this information to inform further stakeholders so they can take into account all the values embodied in the heritage object. In another article, we also focused on immersive environments. So where that could be the visual translation of a digital twin, let's imagine. And that could be used to capture also the values carried by some specific stakeholders, because they can get to have a viewpoint that they don't have while they are on site, but also because they can access some sites that are not accessible to the public, for instance, and we could get information from the general public. So that was another article published in 2022 as well. Some conclusion to this presentation. So there are lots of things to be finished and developed prior to the implementation of digital twin process. So the objectives must be clearly defined to avoid the failure, of course. The available resources and the capacity of the managing context should be clearly defined. Documentation and recording and previous documents available about the heritage object should be collected. And of course, new data should be acquired if necessary to get the digital model that will be used for the digital twin process. Specific risks and variables to be monitored should be identified, all the thresholds defined, and there should be a very deep understanding of the object and its significance. So prior to the evaluation of risks should be made, either based on existing methods or on a new framework, which needs also some development. The criteria to evaluate the pertinence of the conservation actions should also be defined and weighted. So each criteria do not weight the same in the final decision. The protocols for data acquisition, simulation, and management and storage should also be established to avoid getting data, but wrongly formatted, so unusable, unshareable, and in the end for nothing. So it's sometimes better to put more efforts on establishing a data model for the digital twin process that you want to implement than putting all your efforts in acquiring data that will be in the end not usable. Then the question of interoperability. You have to define the data standards that you will use for geometric and non-geometric data. So we saw that with the BIM you have the IFC standards, but there exists a lot of other standards like CTGML, depending on the scale on which you work. And for semantic data, you also have ontologies and the semantic web and a lot of ongoing research about knowledge representation, especially in the field of cultural heritage. We can discuss that as well. So you need to get a shared definition of concept that you use and naming conventions. And as I said, a dedicated data model. And of course, depending on the disciplines that are involved, adopt the necessary domain ontologies, vocabularies, according to the object itself and its particularities. Okay, I will finish here. I think I'm a bit over time, but we had some discussions already into the presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have some extra questions.
We'll do. Okay, there's a question in Spanish. ¿Hay algún objeto o infraestructura que no pueda tener un gemelo digital o que sea muy complicado de poner de tener un gemelo digital de este?
Creo que un gemelo digital depende si se refiere a la calidad de la geometría del objeto digital, porque todo puede tener un gemelo digital, depende del nivel de abstracción. Obviamente a mí me pueden representar como con un cubo, por ejemplo, diciendo, o sea, un cubo es una persona y eso sería mi gemelo digital. Depende del objetivo del estudio o del proyecto. Puede necesitar un nivel obviamente más importante de precisión en la representación gráfica en el 3D, pero creo que, como dije al inicio, no se debe ver con algo donde todo debe ser representado con el máximo nivel de complejidad, porque si no nunca se termina el proyecto y no se cumple nada.
Okay, Eric pregunta, do you see needed innovation process at a short term? How do you think digital twins it will innovate, affect, and what are the long-term architectural words effects? A realistic virtual meta work, perhaps?
Okay, I will take question by question.
Yeah.
Innovation processes at the short term, I think that there is a big research track in semantic web technologies because we have a lot of knowledge representation, ontologies, vocabularies that are already available and that can be implemented and extended according to the needs of the project. And the interest of all these technologies is that afterwards it makes the data much more interoperable. And so I think that that's a track where we have a lot of research to do. So I'm not sure if there is two questions. The second question, will innovate affect? What it will innovate and affect what? I'm not sure to have understood the second part of the question. And a realistic virtual meta world. I think not for today, but maybe for later, but no, we are not yet at this point. As you saw with the question of simulations, with all the things that you have to precise before simulation can be of any use, for now it's worthless. It doesn't bring any benefit. It's a lot of efforts for very little results. So when it's more efficient to do it by a site visit with 4 people, maybe it's better to avoid digital twin. I don't know if I answered the question, but this meta word is, I think, in the field of cultural heritage, it's maybe not ready yet for a complete change at this point.
Okay, Laura asks, are Revit simulation, solar and dating, for example, in any way similar to the process of using digital twins?
It's a type of simulations, of course. Is it useful? I'm not sure in this process, because these simulations can be performed directly based on the 3D and not necessarily based on data, but maybe they will implement other simulations comparing initial data and what is observed in the real time, and maybe observe evolution. So it might come to be of some use, but it's very specific, and it would depend on the site again, and some risks that could be faced. So what would be the problem of maybe related to retrofitting of buildings? If you need, I think in Costa Rica it's not really a problem. You don't have -10 degrees like we have here. So it depends. For design improvements, it might be interesting, but these are things that happen in the process of project design and yeah, some kind of optimized process and automated simulation. I'm not sure it's really useful now. I don't know if I answered the question.
En Spanish. Así como, digamos, al principio el gemelo digital utilizado para mejorar productos, ¿cierto? Ahora, es a ver, lo que voy a tratar de hacer es como un mega resumen, a ver si entendí todo lo que hemos hablado. Lo que vos consideras importante, entonces, tener en el centro los valores que se va a conservar, a preservar o a conservar, los valores del edificio, ¿cierto? Como el centro. Y en función de eso, se determina qué riesgos se tienen, o sí, qué riesgos están presentes para poder minimizarlos, digamos.
Exacto. Exactamente. Es por eso que al inicio de cualquier estudio de patrimonio, lo primero que hacemos es hacer estudios para tratar de entender por qué esos ladrillos, esas piedras, esa tierra, tiene alguna importancia para alguna sociedad en algún tiempo. Y cuando determinamos esto, podemos identificar los riesgos y saber cuál sería su impacto y la pérdida potencial de importancia cultural. Pero si no hacemos esa etapa, es como hacer cualquier cosa se puede perder cualquier pedazo que puede tener un gran valor histórico, cultural o societal. Y si no sabemos por qué tiene valor, si no sabemos qué es su materia, es el diseño, es, no sé, una organización espacial, es su asociación con un evento histórico, es qué hace que esa piedra que está aquí frente mío tiene algún valor. Y creo que obviamente en todo este proceso es lo más difícil de integrar como datos que sean utilizables, porque son subjetivos. Entonces, a la final no tratamos de hacer que sea cantificados de decir este elemento tiene un valor de 10, este tiene de 8, este no es importante, sino más decir vamos a tratar de hacer una trazabilidad, no sé si se dice en español, de poder seguir los valores que cada actor asoció a ese elemento a través de su historia para, para ver cuál es la dimensión, la importancia cultural de este elemento y después poder estimar los riesgos.
Y cómo también eso se visualiza. Es decir,
Ujú.
eh, porque cuando uno entiende al final qué es lo que quiere preservar, eh, todo bien, o sea, yo entiendo bien el hecho de determinar cuál es el valor que se quiere mantener en el tiempo, pero ¿cómo hacemos que otros actores vean justamente ese valor reflejado en el gemelo?
Exacto. Y por esa razón estamos haciendo esos modelos de datos donde se relacionan esos valores con el objeto que está documentado por un modelo 3D y obviamente asociado a ese valor vamos a decir cuál es el aspecto of integrity, por qué razón, o sea, cuál es el elemento de este material que hace que todavía se asocia a su valor. Será la conservación del objeto mismo en su realidad material, digamos, el hecho de que sea el mismo material de hace 500 años, o es más la posición, su ubicación, la manera donde está, cómo está puesto, o la organización espacial de su contexto, y la definición de todos esos elementos permite definir las condiciones que hacen que se transmite esos valores. Y entonces comunicar eso, podemos comunicar de manera escrita, sobre todo la dimensión intangible, ¿cómo se dice? Intangible dimension.
Intangible.
Intangible, bueno. Y para todo lo que es tangible, lo que se refiere a objetos, por eso tenemos la geometría y los modelos digitales que nos permiten comunicar. Entonces, por eso ese estudio, ese artículo que escribimos nos pareció muy importante porque permite justamente a un actor que no conoce necesariamente el mundo de la construcción, pero que se interesa a un patrimonio por alguna razón, puede no solamente contribuir a la evaluación patrimonial, pero también consultar en sitio qué valores están asociados a los elementos y desde dónde les asociaron, porque el punto de vista también puede impactar en la manera, los valores sensoriales, por ejemplo, una vista sobre una ciudad, o que son más subjetivos, pero cuando hay varias personas que identifican el mismo valor desde el mismo punto de vista, ya que tiene más sentido y puede ser más explotado en esos estudios. Entonces, no sé si expliqué, pero es más o menos la idea de representar a la vez de manera escrita por todas las dimensiones intangibles. Por eso, si aquí queremos abrir ese valor, tenemos al lado una descripción, pero también de tener en el espacio esa comprensión del elemento que está asociado a ese valor.
Ok. I don't get this question. Jimena says, how accord, I don't know how to pronounce, uh, how accord are the simulations, comparing them to the regular ones. But I don't know, no sé, o sea, entiendo que cuál precisa son estas simulaciones, pero Jimena, lo que no entiendo es a cuáles simulaciones te referís.
Es que creo que lo que debe quedar claro es que no es una metodología esas simulaciones de las cuales hablo, y por eso hablé de esos challenges, es que no, yo no definí, no elaboré todas esas simulaciones porque pueden haber miles, depende del
Depende de lo que...
contexto,
Ajá.
del caso de estudio, del riesgo, de los valores, y obviamente por eso se debe desarrollar en específico en relación a un proyecto. Entonces, creo que no puedo responder a esa pregunta. Tuviera que analizar con un caso de estudio que ha sido desarrollado.
Sí. Asumo que, eh, digamos, en el ejemplo del trabajo que estamos haciendo en el Teatro Nacional, que queremos medir si se está moviendo o no se está moviendo el teatro,
Ajá.
evidentemente la simulación que veríamos en el gemelo digital no será precisa tal cual, en el sentido que sí deberíamos, el sensor sí debería medir cuánto se está alejando una columna de su pared, digamos, sí debería indicarnos precisamente si se mueve n cantidad de milímetros por año, pero en la simulación del objeto para poder ver eh, o para hacer entender a tal vez personas que no son expertas en estructuras, la simulación sí debería ser exagerada, digamos.
Ah, a ese nivel.
No,
Yo, la verdad, nunca imaginé una simulación geométrica de un daño, sino
ok,
más una información que se transmite y después se hacen los estudios apropiados. Pero eso sería, creo que, demasiado trabajo de implementación y de representación gráfica por lo que realmente aporta. Porque si la información del sensor dice hay una separación de 2 centímetros, eso se pasa del límite que hemos definido, entonces hay un problema
es
y de ahí,
suficiente. Ujú.
creo que de ahí no se requiere explicar esa información a una persona que no es experta porque se requieren justamente expertos a ese nivel para intervenir.
Ujú. Bien, ¿alguna otra pregunta, chicos, chicas, que le quieran hacer a Pierre? Aprovechemos, si no, ok. Con respecto, ok, una pregunta. Bueno,
Bueno,
eh,
vi la pregunta de Belén y Jimena. Ah, no, primero de Belén. No toda la información se debe modelar. Se debe modelar la información a
efectivamente.
partir de la cual necesitamos hacer análisis o simulaciones, pero es imposible modelar toda la información. Se imagine que solo para una foto hay ya una cantidad de metadatos,
Sí,
¿verdad?
mitades.
Entonces, imagínese si tiene que representar todos los datos de todos los documentos iconográficos, bibliográficos, y es imposible y no tiene sentido. Se hace poco a poco, cuando se puede digitalizar muy bien, cuando se puede digitalizar con esa dimensión semántica que se pueden hacer y conducir estudios y análisis mejor, pero es imposible hacerlo para todo, con todo escenario de utilización de datos y todo eso. Es por eso que se debe definir los objetivos con anticipación. Ah,
Y me dice, sí, perdón, estaba preguntando sobre algún gemelo digital y su comparación con la que uno conoce. Cuando preguntaba sobre qué tan precisos tenían que ser la
ah,
simulación.
creo que eso lo definen los usuarios, depende
Ajá.
otra
Y,
vez
y
al
si lo que
objeto.
pregunta Kimberly es, ¿lo que se va a modelar lo define el cliente o uno refiriéndose al profesional, dependiendo de la importancia de lo que
Lo
va a
van
modelar?
definiendo juntos porque el cliente no tiene el conocimiento, por eso se refiere o sea, le llama a un experto. El experto le va a aconsejar sobre lo que tiene que estudiar, pero al final es el cliente que paga. Entonces, creo que lo van definiendo juntos dependiendo de los recursos que son disponibles y de los riesgos, valores, porque a veces no hay los fondos, pero es necesario y se encuentra una manera diferente de lograr los objetivos. Entonces se definen juntos, diría.
Ok.
Lo siento, creo que voy a tener
Sí,
que
sale.
dejarles. Tengo una reunión que empieza, pero si es que tienen cualquier otra pregunta, puedo volver a conectarme luego.
Listo, igual creo que estamos, ya no hay más preguntas y más bien muchísimas gracias, Pierre. Ahí te estamos hablando y pronto te escribo con respecto al acuerdo. Bueno,
Muchas gracias por su atención y hasta luego.
muchas gracias. Hasta luego. Ok, chicos, chicas, vamos a un break. Nos vemos a las 11:05 para tener 20 minutos de descanso. Nos vemos.